Welcome. This is John Kinch with Michigan Energy Options. This is the first in a series we're going to do on the webinar regarding solar in Michigan throughout the summer. It's a silly pun, but solar is a hot topic in Michigan these days, as it is across the Middle West. We're seeing more and more solar development, and people are interested in it. They want to understand it better and ideally adopt it. Our conversation today is going to be around solar siting, and I think siting is interesting even from the standpoint if you ever have spell check on your computer and you type the word siting, oftentimes the computer wants to put the word sitting in there. Siting is kind of an odd term, and it's really both kind of a science and an art to get it right. And we have an expert who's done a lot of solar projects who's going to join us and discuss this with me. Understand we're recording this webinar as well, so we'll put it on our website once we're done. We also really want to encourage audience participation. So if you have a question that's burning, so to speak, dump it in the chat room and we'll answer it as we go along. But we're also going to leave plenty of time at the end of our discussion to include questions from you all, and it can either be questions you can ask orally or over putting it in chat. So Michigan Energy Options, real quickly, is a 40-year-old nonprofit in Michigan. We have offices in East Lansing, Marquette, and Grand Rapids. We have been working primarily on energy efficiency over the decades, but in recent times, and most germane to this topic today, we've begun to do more solar work. We do a lot of solar scopes for commercial and public institutions, helping them understand how they could locate solar on their property. We've also been a part of 2 community solar parks, one of which through an LLC that we actually own and operate. And that experience has been one that has really helped us understand the benefits and the challenges of doing solar projects from the ground up, literally. Our partners in that community solar project in East Lansing include the Lansing Board of Water and Light, the City of East Lansing, Pivot Energy, and MEO, Michigan Energy Options. And one of the important aspects of that project was the work that Brian Maillet brought to it in terms of both helping us with the engineering of it and also helping us with the financing of it. So I'm going to move my slide here if I can and ask Brian here in a minute to get ready to join us and talk about solar siting. Real quick, Brian is the CEO of Renewable Energy Evolution. He's done a lot of megawatts of solar across the country and across the Middle West. The intended outcomes of this particular presentation, from my standpoint at least, is to tackle the science, art, and politics of solar siting. In politics, I mean both capital P and lower P. I want to get us to have a good working definition of what solar siting is. I want to talk about what's today's norm and what might be the new norm. And regarding the new norm, I just want to share with you all some information out of Rhode Island that recently was published about the challenges that they're having with solar siting. Now, Rhode Island is a considerably smaller place than Michigan, but nonetheless, I think the issues there are probably issues that a lot of states in the country are facing. And really the issue is that a lot of solar projects require lots of property. It takes about 5 acres for a megawatt of solar. And this report talks about that those who are living in the rural communities are really seeing a lot of pressure from solar on their properties, and people are having mixed feelings about it. This article talks about something called solar sprawl. And let me just read you one quick paragraph from that article. In Rhode Island, only very large energy facilities, those larger than 40 megawatts, are approved for siting at the state level. This means that siting of solar projects is handled almost exclusively by cities and towns. This work poses a significant challenge for many communities which may lack the resources or technical expertise to site projects appropriately. Many of our cities and towns still have no solar siting ordinances in place. In wake of the debates over the controversial project, some communities have even enacted complete moratoria on solar projects threatening to slow the state's transition to clean energy. So I want to bring Brian Maillet on to talk about how we can do solar siting right in the state of Michigan, because we are very much about pushing as much as we can for clean energy in our state. So Brian, can you join us?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you all for attending this, and John, thank you for extending the invite for me to talk about solar siting. Again, like what John was saying, you know, I've been in this solar market space for quite a while, operating out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, learning a lot in different areas of the United States, you know, where solar was very prevalent, and then bringing that back here to the Midwest. So, you know, this introductory slide here, I kind of, you know, I think when folks go, you know, hey, we can, you know, you can put solar anywhere, essentially. There are some very minor constraints as far as conceptualizing the space needed for solar. And you know, I think this blurb up here is, you know, we only need close to, 200,000 square miles to power the entire planet with solar, basically the size of Spain. You know, but that's easier said than done. You know, what are our options here? You know, and that's what we're going to go into here. Is that it's about location and it's about the infrastructure in place. You know, of course, you know, solar, you need flat areas, low sloping grades. There are going to be buffer areas and environmental constraints, subsurface constraints, points of interconnection are mission critical, and then finally energy density, which gets a little heady. But you know, whenever you start bringing in, you know, these bullets below, you know, the concept of, hey, we can put solar everywhere, you know, starts to fall apart. Next slide. Okay, so, you know, I think this is a good example of when we talk about flat areas. Oh, I mean, no, not flat areas, areas of open space that have some gentle slopes to it. In the very beginning stages of this of solar, you know, it was like applicable in the desert landscape, flat as a pancake, you know, no slopes, no trees, no nothing. As we get here into the Midwest, you know, we're not a desert here. You know, we have to work with the land, and that land is going to have slopes, marginal lands, you know, that are going to have slopes. They're going to have, so geotechnical is important. Racking technology has improved where you can have greater slopes. You know, the slope tolerance of racking has improved. But along those lines, you know, understanding the design parameters and also shading. You know, when you go into sloped areas, you got to have larger row spacing, you know, to prevent shading, inter-row shading, as they call it. You know, so when you go into marginal areas that have slopes, that have trees, have, you know, these intrinsic things about the land, that changes the design. So when you're trying to shoehorn, you know, 1 megawatt on 4 acres out in the desert, well, in the Midwest with slopes and trees, you know, that's now maybe 6 acres. And that's the whole premise of this. Next slide. So this just adds on to the land part. You know, buffers and environment. You know, again, especially in Michigan. You know, I've done a lot of work in Michigan, with solar and other types of development. And you have trees. Trees have their own habitats. You got bat issues, bird issues, etc. But you can't have like, look at the site. The reason why I picked this picture is when I look at this, I go, okay, that's nice. You got solar panels and flowers, and oh, it's nice and friendly. But I can almost guarantee you, if you did a shading analysis on this, those panels would get shaded by those adjacent trees. And that's lost revenue for the project. So, I think, whenever folks are thinking about doing solar, they need to understand what is around, what are these buffers? How far do I have to offset from a tree area? Can I go in there with a chainsaw and knock down all these trees? Is it worth doing that? Because now I'm exposing the solar farm to a nearby highway. And, you have not in my backyard, folks. Other things, are wetlands, that's very prevalent here in the Midwest. Has anyone, done their due diligence? I mean, when I look at this picture, just how I'm very pragmatic, I go, man, I bet there's a wetland out there. Did anyone look into that? Airports are another sensitive topic. Solar systems, typically most of them, you have to report them to the FAA. Land rights, that's kind of a buffer situation. If you're building out this solar energy system and you have rights to do it on this property, and then you have to get an easement to connect it to the grid, well, okay, what does that entail? So there are a lot of little nuances associated with the initial concept that have to be addressed. Otherwise, it's just going to be, what I call a stranded asset. And there are plenty of solar stranded assets in this country. Subsurface. This project is one of the first ones I worked on in Fort Huachuca military base down in Arizona. It was around 19 megawatt. And, I think when you look at this, when we first looked at this site, we were like, oh, it's flat, no trees, easy interconnect, substations next door, on and on and on. But, the subsurface, and so I was thinking about that, and I was looking up quotes, and I'm like, Marcus Aurelius, who was emperor of Rome, I think he was like the fifth one, he has a quote of, look beneath the surface, let not the several quality of a thing nor its worth escape thee. And I think that's very applicable to this project. Everyone was like, yeah, this is great. What a great area to put solar. And what we eventually found out later, is that there were some areas out in this desert landscape where there was a lychee, which is basically a hard concrete sand that once you hit it, you're going to have to get like high impact augers to get through it in order to set your piles for the foundations of your systems. And that ended up being a very costly thing. And then in doing that rework of the subsurface, it then caused erosion issues on the surface. So, you had one causer going into another. And, solar, ideally you want to get it out there and get it done relatively quickly. And that means going out there and just driving, piles of steel into the ground to set your racking for your panels. And when you run into those type of obstacles, it can be very costly. So here's another picture, and I think this is very applicable. What I find sometimes is people will come up to me and go, "Hey, I got this great piece of land, and I went out and looked at it, and it's ideal for solar. It's flat, it doesn't have any wetlands, no land right, land rights will be easy, no trees, on and on and on." And they go, "And it's right next to a transmission line." And I go, "Okay, that's great. I mean, that means that you have a lot of energy that's being transmitted from a substation, but we're not going to put the solar onto these big transmission lines. They have to go to distribution lines, and then or to a meter, which goes to a distribution line, which then goes to a substation. And then along those distribution lines, you got to make sure you have capacity on those circuits. Otherwise, you're going to end up spending a lot of money, almost equal to the value of that solar energy system, to get it through the substation, to put it on the transmission lines. So, that's kind of an interesting topic is, when you're doing solar siting, you kind of have to be a jack of all. You have to understand permitting, regulations, subsurface geotechnical, civil engineering, electrical engineering. You got to check all these boxes. You can't just go out and say, "I got a piece of land, let's put solar on it." That's just going back to my first slide of, hey, let's just solarize Spain, be done with it. So this kind of gets into the weeds here. I'm kind of making I've been reading a book on energy density. I'm almost done with it, and it really goes into so I kind of made this twofold. You got the caveman, who's frightened about energy in general, much less solar in their backyard, and then you have your technologies, and I think this is where we can be educational to the folks who are maybe confused about what solar really means. It's all based on technology density. Solar technology continues to evolve and get greater in terms of energy efficiency. And when you go, all right, I'm going to occupy 5 acres of land with panels, what's the energy coming out of that 5 acres? And, from the overall, say, the sun has, whatever, the sun's not associated with the earth. It's, out, it doesn't occupy a space, the solar array panels do. But if you look at other types of energy, petroleum, you have petroleum basins, and that, fuel gets routed to, a refinery, which then gets distributed to an oil plant, an oil electrical plant. Same thing with natural gas, and what this all boils down to is that whenever we run into, I believe, folks that are very wary of solar, seeing that solar farm there, the case can be made that we have an antiquated energy infrastructure that needs to be updated, and it will have to be updated, with more generation as coal-fired power plants start to be decommissioned because they're outdated. They've outlived their life expectancy. So, would you like to see a coal-fired power plant out here in the countryside, where you're going to have rail coming in to deliver coal, ash ponds, coal, everything associated with coal. Not only that, but I don't think, up in the upper Midwest, there's a lot of coal mining. So, all of that goes into, the energy density discussion. That, yeah, you're going to have a field of solar panels out there for 25 years or more. But, look at the alternatives and the energy density associated with them. And wind is not even on here because its energy density is one of the lowest because it's so spread out. That's about wraps it up for me.
Thank you, Brian. I got a lot of questions to follow up with. I want to also, though, honor questions folks might have put into the chat while you were speaking. And if you would do us a favor, I think if you can turn your webcam on, they can see your smiling face. I think my semi-smiling face is already on everybody's computer. There you are. Thank you again. Can you speak so we can make sure we can hear you?
I'm here.
Good, thanks. Really good. So I got a lot of things to talk about, but like I said, first, Michael, anybody in the chat ask any questions?
I think right now we're okay. Just if anybody has any questions, feel free to put them into the chat, and when John asks, I can certainly unmute everybody.
Thank you, Michael. This is Michael Larson, by the way. He runs our Upper Peninsula office in Marquette, so he's a good 400 miles away from me, but in the same state, which always shocks people who live out east. Anyway, well, I was telling you earlier, Brian, that yesterday I spent the day at the Michigan Public Service Commission in a workshop around distribution, and a lot of discussion around distribution is, of course, how can we bring on all these renewable energy assets, solar in particular, and how can the grid function in what it is right now? And of course, the answer is it can't. We need to do all kinds of upgrades to the distribution grid to make solar function. But also, as you were pointing out, it isn't just merely connecting to a particular substation or distribution line. One of the things that was shared with us yesterday were all these heat maps that were showing a distribution grid in which there is congestion or capacity. And oftentimes that's only really kind of known by the utilities themselves. So you may think you have a good location for solar based on the site. You may think you have a good location based upon the city or whatever the local jurisdiction is wanting to have that located there, but you might have the nearest wire or substation full of congestion and you can't connect. So talk a little bit about that world, which is very baroque to me because it's very complex, and I'm only beginning to understand all that detail.
Yeah, I mean, that is the, going back to deployment of solar, unless, you're going to put it on the side of a mountain, which I think technology exists where you can pound piles into the side of a mountain and hang them off the side. The main constraint, in my opinion, is the grid. You can have the best idea related to solar, and unless you're going to build your own smart grid, you have to play by the utility rules and regulations. And the only entities out there, unless you're like in California, that's pretty far advanced. I mean, you can go to the CalISO or one of the each individual utility in California, and they have been required to map out capacity and constraints on their grid. So you can easily map that out. New York is another state that also has that type of mapping. So it kind of goes back to, someone going, hey, I got 80 acres of land and I want to, solarize it. Okay, solarize it. It's not going to go anywhere. You can go put it onto your house, but you're not going to be able to export that energy without understanding what the lines are for the utility. I mean, I have a case in point out in Nevada. And this was a few years back, I had a developer come up to me and was like, I figured it out. We have a back way of getting into CalISO, through this one little annexed area of Nevada. and I have a landowner on board, we can do 100 megawatt of solar here. And we started diving into it and found out that, the local utility there wasn't going to allow solar onto the lines. And basically they said, if you want to get this solar energy into CAISO and make a lot of money, you're going to have to build your own substation and lines of interconnection. And that totally destroyed the project.
Yeah, the other player in all this, of course, in addition to the utility, whether the utility has the hosting capacity, as that term is used, to locate a solar project in a particular place on its distribution grid, has everything to do with the local jurisdiction and the zoning and permitting regulations they have there. We already seen this in Michigan. I think there's at least a township or two that have put out moratoria on more solar being developed. That has certainly happened in the case of wind. And so I think one of the other challenges in that piece I read briefly before we got going illustrates that, is that it's all different out there. And so depending what local jurisdiction you're working in, you may have a whole different set of permitting and zoning that you need to get over in order to locate a solar project there. And moreover, some solar projects, the big ones at least, may cross several jurisdictions at once, and thus you need to get all sets of documents lined up for all those different jurisdictions that might have different policies in place. What do you think would be a solution to that piece of the puzzle that might help Michigan, kind of adopt more solar energy easier?
Yeah, I mean, another state here in the Midwest that's kind of going through I guess a solar, I mean, at least in my opinion, it's kind of leading the charge on development of solar is Illinois. And, we've been going through a lot of lessons. I mean, I think what was it, 3 years ago when I started working on some of the policy groups there, it was, every municipality, county has their own ordinances, and a lot of them are based off of wind, because wind is pretty prevalent. Wind was the first out here in the Midwest, and a lot of the ordinances associated with wind are not applicable to solar. But you've got these AHJs, authorities having jurisdiction, that are overwhelmed. They don't know what solar is, and they know what wind is. I've been in the meetings where, it's gone late into the night, and, the one of the board members is like, all right, yeah, I got to drive home now and look at the invasion of the aliens, the red lights bleeping off of the wind turbines. So, it's because it's not very prevalent in the Midwest, people are going to question it. They're very pragmatic, and they don't understand it. And the easy way for them to do it is to go and peel off, the wind ordinances and say, hey, this is what you can go by, which is totally not applicable. I've made the case before of these boards that solar is more like a substation. It has a fence around it. It has, some metal boxes or panels, if you want to make that analogy, that, are 8 feet tall, and it's compact within an area. To make the cross between wind and solar as far as ordinances is a bit of a stretch. It's more like solar to, a substation.
Yeah, and let's talk a little bit more about solar and ag lands, because that's more, open lands. That's a topic that I've been very interested in for years. I have a land use background from the Nature Conservancy, and I have concerns about putting nature under glass, so to speak. That said, Minnesota and other states have done this, and Michigan is going to be following suit. Recently, through an executive order of Governor Whitmer's, they're going to allow solar to be developed in prime agricultural land with this caveat. So not only could it be developed in other parts of the state that are not necessarily prime ag land, but for the prime ag land, One of the requirements is to, make sure that you're going to return that land to its its existing state beforehand 25 years from now. So there's that kind of reclamation piece of it. That's the covenant to that. Also, it's also the statute or the executive order encourages co-locating ag with pollinator species. In other words, you plant flowers and native grasses and those kinds of things that support insects, bees, bird habitat, and those kinds of things, so that actually it has a benefit to those agricultural operations. If you think about fruit trees, and some of those kinds of things. My point is that as I think about solar development, and I think about people's concerns about it, I think we have plenty of marginal lands where you can locate solar. Obviously, you can do it in ag lands, but you need to do it with the idea that you're going to, ideally make those ag lands even more productive, perhaps in a different way. But also, you can locate solar on capped landfills, brownfields, right-of-ways, airports, all these other kinds of places. I think that are suited to locate solar, but oftentimes are not the first choice of solar developers, or even the utilities who are looking for the least offtake price they can get, because there takes a little more effort in developing those and making sure that they work. And I will pick on our own project, Brian, that you and I worked on. East Lansing Community Solar Park is located on a capped landfill. And we had some hurdles we had to get over to make that happen. And also, by the way, we're locating pollinator species there as well. So we can talk about that piece of it a little bit.
Yeah. That's kind of it can get pretty complicated quickly. I mean, I have done like large scale, utility solar, 20 megawatt, tracker systems and whatnot. I think the way, and not only that, but, in Michigan, you hear about other developers who are making these big land grabs, working with farmers or, working exclusively with farmers to build out 100 megawatt of solar, largest solar system in the state. What I find is just from a grid perspective, that we don't get a lot of sunlight like, California or Arizona here in the Midwest. So that makes solar more infrequent, call it unreliable, to the grid. You're not getting, you're getting maybe, 230 days of solar light versus, 350, out in the desert. So that infrequency plays an important role in how it rolls out here in the Midwest and in the Northeast, in areas where there's not a lot of sunlight. And, the concept of doing a big solar farm on a bunch of farmland is almost twofold. You're taking farmland away, from the outsider who's looking at that and going, man, now we're going to have food scarcities, or whatever they can come up with in their mind. We have to change that perception. And now you have a very infrequent energy source, that could wreak havoc on the grid. And that's why I've just seen how everything has evolved as solar has come in from the coast into the Midwest, is that it lends itself to more of a distributed generation concept, kind of like what's in Germany, which is where I cut my teeth. 1 megawatt here, 5 megawatt here. It's closer to the energy infrastructure. It's not located way out in the middle of nowhere, and now you have to build a whole energy infrastructure to get that to the folks who need it. And that plays into marginal lands, because when you're in a more urban area where demand is located, you're going to have those marginal lands, and you're going to have 1 megawatt here, 2 megawatt here, a half a megawatt there, and it's going to be more beneficial to the grid. because, you know, you're not going to have, you know, the grid solely dependent on, you know, hey, we've met our RPS and it's 100 megawatt way out, you know, in the middle of nowhere. You know, it's kind of a false positive in my opinion. You know, I think we got to be smart, and it does take some additional due diligence on the front end, which a lot of, you know, some solar developers don't want to do that. They just want to do a real estate transaction.
Yeah, and I want to open it up for questions to the
Yeah,
audience. I do want to play off of one thing you just said, though. I think one of the important elements is community education and awareness. And so groups such as Michigan Energy Options and others, Groundwork up in Traverse City, are spending a lot of time trying to help local governments and communities understand how this all works so that they aren't adverse to it, but instead want to adopt it. And it really is I think it's a partnership. It's a communication between what you know as the experts and what people may not know or be concerned about. But also I think it's about moving projects forward that have a community element to them, such as community solar, which is of course what you and I have done in East Lansing with Board of Water and Light, and which we hope to do other projects as well in the state. Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, so I did have you know, one question here, and it kind of starts with communities. And for those communities that don't currently have any zoning or regulation around solar, in particular, or renewables, what is the starting point for them as far as resources to begin, you know, considering being able to have renewables in their community?
Want me to grab that, Brian? Real quick, they can certainly reach back to us, Michael. We'd be happy to share it with them, the materials we have. There's a number of other nonprofits and others that are in this space that can help provide some of those basic kind of documents, templates, if you will, that can help a community begin to understand how they can introduce solar into their various zoning ordinances and permitting processes. In other words, it's been done already. They shouldn't reinvent the wheel, and we can help.
Yeah. I mean, I'll throw this in. I mean, in Illinois, for instance, when we were looking at this as working for the Illinois Solar Energy Association, we came up with a 3 to 4 page talking point memorandum that we distributed to as many permitting bodies as possible, to kind of inform them that this is standard energy practice. You know, here are the typical buffers. Here's what you need to look for. You know, you need to have a decommissioning plan. You know, all the bases. And then we even had in there a narrative to kind of offset, you know, what may start up out there, you know, where they're like, well, you know, why, you know, yeah, that sounds great, but, you know, and we would answer, you know, those contrarian statements. It was a good memo, and you know, I think that actually the ICEA website probably has it still on there to download, or I can send it out to the group. I mean, it's a good talking point memo.
There's lots of good national solar.orgs out there that are working on these kinds of things, and they've accomplished things in other states, and be happy to share that information with you. Any other questions, Michael? Or are people's mics open if they want to ask a question directly?
Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody right now, and so feel free to chime in, and I will unmute everybody right now. Oh, and so if you want to ask a question, feel free to go ahead and unmute yourself. So it looks like I've given everybody the option to unmute themselves. All right, so we do have an additional question here. One of the questions is that you know, can you talk about what you see as policy barriers to getting more solar on brownfields, such as tax policy, tax rates are higher in urban areas, you know, fears about liability, maybe not large enough parcels?
I can take a crack at that. Um, so this all goes back to like the levelized cost of energy for solar, which is, ideally it comes down to cost to implement. The capex is heavy on a solar project, with energy projects in general. Um, to go onto a landfill or a brownfield, that's added cost. So you kind of have this juggling act of, you know, hey, if I go out and get this vacant land or even this farmland that's right outside the city, you know, and it's easy for me to build solar on it, great. But if I'm going to be forced, or not forced, but if everybody wants me to put solar on a brownfield, I can't bring that cost into the development equation. So other states have incentives to allow that to occur. Massachusetts, New York, California had it for a while. It was and basically incentives to allow development of solar on marginal lands. Otherwise, it's you're not going to find a lot of folks who are going to want to make that leap.
And let me point out a resource that folks should look up. It's through the Environmental Law Policy Center, which are friends and partners of Michigan Energy Options. In fact, our next solar webinar is going to have Margareta Kearney from ELPC talking about solar laws in Michigan. But they've got a project called Brownfields to Brightfields there in ELPC, and that really has really wonderful information about how brownfields can be converted into bright fields where you can put solar on those, and it has lots of good information regarding legal issues, zoning issues, things such as that. I will say, I think one thing that would help developing solar more on brownfields is having TIF financing, tax increment financing going towards these projects. TIF typically is used by local jurisdictions in building projects to clean up kind of environmental hazards that are left, plumes and things like that that are left from previous industrial or manufacturing uses of that property. But as far as I've been able to find out, I haven't seen in Michigan TIF money being put towards a solar project, which, as Brian was saying, would help to knock down some of that capital cost, that additional capital costs of building on that site, which does have its own challenges versus something which is a greenfield. Any other, Michael, as we get down to our last minute or two?
I think that goes ahead and answers some of those questions that we had there. But if anybody else wants to ask a final question, we can still take another here.
Absolutely. Let me pause here for a second, because I want to be respectful. We said from 10 to 10:45 we have the room, so to speak. So I want to make sure people can go on and enjoy their workday Friday. So as I mentioned, we have a couple more of these webinars coming up. A couple more experts are going to join us. The one next is going to be, I got to move this cursor out of my way. It's going to be on Friday, July 26th. That's Margareta Kearney, as I mentioned, of ELPC. She's going to talk about solar laws in Michigan. Also take a look at some of the other solar laws around the country in the Middle West to do some comparing and contrast. And then on September 19th, I have Marta Tomic from Vote Solar joining me to talk about community solar-like projects. Community solar-like implies that we have community solar, which we'll define for you then, but there's also some other ways to kind of do projects that have a number of participants in the project but maybe are not quite community solar, so that should be interesting. Brian, any closing thoughts you might have for the audience regarding siting?
None really. I just really, I think that solar is going to be more prevalent in Michigan as the years go on, and I think if it's thought out carefully, or not carefully, but at least not haphazardly. It can be that part of energy upgrades that are needed for our community, and it's clean, and it's clean, and it has a lot of other implications to it. It's easy to educate the folks on it whenever you have that audience. There's so many different benefits, from STEM to education to clean energy.
And maybe I'll take the closing remark on this, because it made me think, Brian, of a solar conference, the Midwest Solar Expo that I was at in Minneapolis earlier this year, in which I spoke, and the CEO of EDF, which is a large solar developer, international solar developer, said, I'm looking out across the horizon for the solar industry, and his comment was that those solar companies that will be successful are going to be emphasizing location, location, location. And that has everything to do with what Brian talked about in siting, in terms of near interconnection and so on and so forth. But also, he was also making the point that there is going to be resistance to solar by communities, and that's going to be the reality the industry faces. And the other energy expert that I heard a week later at a different conference was Mary Powell of Green Mountain Power, and she was saying, to her mind regarding solar, that small is beautiful. That, in other words, and just think about a state like Vermont, to locate, as Brian was saying earlier, more of those kind of 1 to 5 megawatt projects on ideally vacant marginal land is going to be what she sees as the future for solar, at least in Vermont. A couple people, I think, who have been pretty successful and know this industry and probably are understanding where it's going next. So with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us. As I said, this is going to be recorded, so feel free to listen to it again if you can't get to sleep at night, or send it on to friends or colleagues who might be interested in this as well. And thank you, and happy Friday.